Hi everyone, Stepan here. I'm going to continue the series on the Vienna with the Mieses Variation, or pawn to g3 on move 3, which is arguably the most positional way for white to play the Vienna game, and it goes against the principles of the Vienna in my opinion. You're not playing for an early f4, you're not playing an attacking game, you're playing for small imbalances that could positionally bring you an advantage later on. Okay, so in this position, white plays pawn to g3. And this means that the bishop is going to be fianchettoed on g2, and there's going to be long-term pressure down the diagonal from h1 to a8. That's going to be the main theme of this position, and that's going to be what black's responses are going to be about. Okay, so in many positions, black will have trouble developing their pieces normally because of this diagonal. For example, there's a knight on c6, there are no pawns in the center, white can take, black is forced to take with the b pawn because the d pawn has moved, and in some cases that's going to lead to tactical trouble. It's stuff like that that's going to be important in this position. The second thing that's going to be important is who gets to play d4 or d5. We are going to see that in the main lines, black plays d5 straight away. Now, that's probably the best idea. That's the most active way for black to play, but it does open up the long diagonal for the bishop very early on. So our main lines will be d5 straight away, and after e takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop g2, you can see that this bishop is wide open, okay? And the bishop has a ton of play. Alternatively, black can go for positions with either bishop c5 or knight c6 on move 3, which signify, and they are going to transpose into each other with one exception, which I'm going to show you. They signify that black aims to play d6 instead of d5, thus keeping this white pawn on e4 and making the bishop less efficient. Now, that's not as ambitious for black, but I believe it's safer. Then the third types of positions we're going to be looking at are positions with c6 on move 3, and this means two things. Firstly, it's going to be easier to play d5. d5 is going to be supported a bit more, but it doesn't mean that cd5 will be played in the event of d5, ed5. It just means that there will be a pawn on c6 that's going to be blocking this bishop along the diagonal. And even in lines where black doesn't play c6 on move 3, c6 is going to be a common move to blunt the bishop. And the final types of positions we're going to be looking at are positions with bishop to b4. Now, bishop b4 may seem straightforward, but it's not. It's not about weakening the e-pawn, because let's say this is a Spanish in reverse, and in the Spanish, white plays the move bishop b5, attacking the knight on c6, aiming to weaken the e5 pawn. This is not about weakening e4, because white can easily play the move bishop g2. It's about later on inducing a structural weakness by taking on c3 and having a small imbalance that should positionally work out for black in the endgame. So this is the final type of position we're going to be looking at. So we're looking at 4 different ways for black to play, and white's aim is almost always going to be to have pressure on the queen side, and as we are going to see in the main lines, the usual combination of pieces is going to be a rook on b1 and the bishop on g2. Those are going to be white's main weapons. So let's get going. Let's start with pawn to d5. So d5 says, okay, you didn't do anything too active. I have enough pieces controlling d5. I can blast through the center straight away and aim to equalize. And that's true. I would say that black is just about equal. And after pawn d5, e d5, knight d5, there's this forced line that starts bishop g2, and black simply takes on c3. Now, we always take with the b pawn. And this is the starting position of the g3 Vienna, in my opinion. This is the key position that you have to know and that you have to understand. So we can now see that the rook is coming to b1. We can see that the bishop is putting pressure on b7. We can see that a move like knight c6 followed by rook b8, for example, knight c6, rook b1, rook b8 loses straight away. Let me just show you that. So knight c6, rook b1, rook b8, and game over. Okay, so that's one type of tactical problem black could encounter. Before we get into the theory of the Mieses variation in the Vienna, I would like to thank today's sponsor, Chessbook. Chessbook is a great tool for building and learning your repertoire. What you do with Chessbook is you import your repertoire either by hand. So for example, I go to my black repertoire, edit something else. Let's say I want to do the semi-Slav. Let's say this is my repertoire. Against d4, I go d5. Let's say against c4, I go c6. They go knight f3, I go knight f6, they go knight c3, and I want the semi-Slav. Now I have to explore bishop g5, I have to explore e3, and so on. Let's say I want to import bishop g5. Against this, I play the anti-Moscow, h6. Okay, they are going to retreat with bishop h4 and I win my pawn. Okay, I take my pawn. Now in this case, white goes e4 and I can keep going forever, but let's say I want to add this to my repertoire. Save moves my repertoire. And now what I can do is I can practice my repertoire. It's going to quiz me. But I don't have to import my repertoire by hand. What I can do, like I did for what I'm showing you in this video, I can just import the PGN file by going, let's say, white, more options, import, and I've imported a full PGN of the study I used to create this video on the Mieses variation of the Vienna, and that's going to be my repertoire for white. So in this case, my white repertoire is the Vienna. So what I can do with that is I can connect my online Lichess and chess.com accounts, and it will connect them to my repertoire. It will recognize where I'd gone wrong based on my repertoire. So if I'd made some mistakes in the semi-Slav or the Caro-Kann or the Vienna, it's going to say there's a mistake. And then I can fix that. It's going to quiz me on the mistakes. I can also practice my repertoire. So if I go practice moves, let's say everything that's due for review, okay, so in this case, it went d5, so this is the Mieses Vienna main line. I take this, knight takes, I go bishop g2, I take with the b pawn because I want the b file for my rook. Against bishop c5, I can go knight e2 or knight f3, I prefer knight f3. I can also go knight e2, and it basically keeps going like that. Against knight c3, let's say a castle, and so on and so on. So it quizzes you on your entire repertoire. It focuses on the biggest gaps you have in your knowledge, and eventually you're going to learn your repertoire in a very easy way. Now, what you have here is the basic version of Chessbook, the free version. It only allows you to import a couple of hundred moves, and I'm using that, so it's sufficient if you only want the basics. But if you want the full thing, it's about $5 a month, and then you get unlimited moves. I think it's useful. I use it, and I think it's going to help learn your repertoire and make it much easier. Okay, thanks very much to Chessbook. Okay, so we reach this key position. After b takes c3, we know the patterns, and black has a choice. Black can either go bishop d6 or bishop c5. That's what's going to differentiate the two positions. In both cases, black is going to continue knight c6, so that's going to be a similarity, but bishop c5 and bishop d6 is going to be the key difference. The first thing we can notice is that a bishop on c5 controls the d4 square. So the first conclusion we can make is that in positions with bishop c5, white isn't going to be playing d4. And maybe it will work at some point, but it's definitely going to be harder. For example, the knight moves out to f3, the knight moves out to c6. If we count the defenders, and let's say we turned on the engine and went d4, for example. Black is already slightly better after e takes d4, maybe queen e2. If you play c takes d4, then basically black has too many defenders, so it doesn't work now. It may work in some cases, but not always. So bishop c5, that's the first thing it does. Fights for the d4 square. The second thing it does, it prepares to defend the b7 pawn. In many cases, and it may not be relevant now, but there's an open b file, so in many cases a move like bishop b6 is just going to be a safe move that defends the diagonal. It's going to make moves like c6 more efficient. But then again, it also runs into something like d4, and it also runs into something like bishop e3. Okay, which is a move white would usually like to make to exchange the strong bishop. One thing we can also notice is that the bishop is looking at f2. Now, when black plays bishop d6, instead of bishop c5, the first thing we can notice is that d4 is much easier to play. So in most cases, white is going to be going for d4. But the e5 pawn is defended, and black doesn't have to react to d4. So when there's a bishop on d6 and the knight on c6, in most cases, black's position is more solid. So this is going to be the main way for black to play. Let's start with bishop c5. Okay, after bishop c5, we can go knight f3 or knight e2. After knight e2, white is always slightly worse according to the engine because the knight just isn't as active. We are not afraid of the move e4, which is the only downside to knight f3 I can see. You can go, after e4, you can go knight d4, giving up a pawn, or you can go knight e5. Now, this position has been played only a couple of times. Knight d4 has never been played, but I like it. If I had white here, I'd go knight d4, give up a pawn, queen d4, watch out for your rook, so rook b1, and after castles, we can now see that white has tremendous pressure on e4 and on this b7 pawn. If f5 is ever played, then the light square diagonal is weak. The queen is definitely misplaced and bishop b2 is coming, rook e1 is coming, white has the bishop pair, white has a ton of compensation for the pawn. If you don't want to give up a pawn, you can then go knight e5, which is also fine. And after something like queen f6, there's this trick, you can castle here. And after queen e5, you can go d4. Of course, en passant cannot be played because of rook e1. And once the queen retreats, let's say to f5 or to e6, we can now throw in rook e1. We're on the pawn. And after black either defends or castles, we can then take the bishop. So e4 isn't a problem, which is why I believe against bishop c5, you should go knight f3. Okay, if e4 doesn't work, then knight f3 has to be better than knight e2. Okay, black of course does not play e4. That's not a good move. It's not that it's losing for black, but it doesn't do anything. Okay, black is going to go knight c6, fighting against d4. White castles, black castles, and now rook e1. There are other moves. You can go rook b1, you can go queen e2, you can go d3, but basically you want to go d3, put your rooks on b and e files, and put pressure on the pawn, provoking some weaknesses. Okay, d4, as I said, should not be played. So in most cases, white will go for a setup with c4, d3, and maybe a bishop on e3. Okay, so let's look at rook e1, queen f6 defends the pawn, d3. Now, whenever d3 or d4 is played, black really should go h6 because positionally you are getting far less space if you allow a move like bishop g5, so h6. And white now has no other choice but to develop the dark squared bishop. I think that's the best idea. Playing bishop b2 could be kind of risky, so bishop e3, getting rid of this pressure on f2 is, I think, the best way to go about it. Bishop b6, saving the b pawn in advance. Now knight d2. And knight d2 is possible because you played bishop e3. It's looking at the b3 square, the c4 square. It's attempting to exchange these dangerous bishops and make this pretty bishop even more active. For example, rook e8, knight b3, looking at the c5 square. Maybe we're going to go c4, c5. If we do go c4, that's going to force an exchange on e3. So for example, bishop f5, c4, and now black really does have to take. It's not that you cannot save your bishop, but if you go a6, then c5, and your bishop is pretty much dead anyway. So bishop e3, we take with the rook. Let's say rook a d8, queen e2, and there's some pressure along this diagonal, some pressure on the e5 pawn. We have the c5 square, we're controlling d4, maybe we reroute the knight back to e4, maybe we triple up on the e file. It's a fairly pleasant position, so I don't think bishop c5 is key. Coming back, bishop d6, the alternative, is what I think is better. Again, we're not afraid of e4, so we just go knight f3. We can go knight e2. Knight e2 is the alternative move, because the only advantage, the only upside to knight e2 is that you don't block in the bishop. So if we do go knight e2, then let's say castles and c3 blocking the bishop, d3, we also could go d4. Something like knight d7, c4, knight f6, rook b1. Again, we're on the pawn, h6. I don't think this is enough. If black can play c6 and just blunt my bishop, I'd prefer to have my knight on f3. So we're going to look at knight f3 instead of knight e2. Again, e4 doesn't work. In this case, we just go knight d4, and there's no pressure on the knight. It's just a great knight on d4. If c5 is played, then c6 can never be played, which means that this diagonal is permanently weak. So against knight f3, black shouldn't go e4, black castles. We castle as white, and now knight c6. And the key positions we reach in this bishop d6 main line are positions with rook b1. Now, I should mention that d4 or d3 can be played either before or after rook b1, but in most cases you're going to go rook b1 anyway. So I believe starting with rook b1 is the best idea. Again, d3 and d4 can be played. If you've downloaded the study on the Vienna, I've given detailed variations on d3 and d4. But here, let's just go rook b1 because there are many transpositions, and this is just the most active and the main move. Okay, so rook b1. Black goes rook b8. And now, if this knight was on e2, white just wins with bishop takes knight. So what we have to do now is we have to free up a square for the knight. We have to fight for the center. We're using the fact that the bishop isn't on c5, and we go d4. Okay, now black has to do something, and has to do something pretty quickly. If, for example, h6, then we can consider a move like knight d2 straight away, and this of course cannot be taken because we just take on c6. And if something like bishop d7 has to be played, then maybe we can exchange on e5. So h6 is a move, but I think there's a stronger move. There's bishop g4, and bishop g4 just gets rid of this pin. So bishop takes c6 is never a threat. It also pins the white knight. And now black has to be careful. White is going to go h3. Now, black either loses the game now or has a very active position, which is why I think bishop g4 is great, but you have to know the follow-up. Most people play bishop h5 here, blundering the position away and giving up a pawn. I'm going to show you what the problem is. After bishop h5, which works in many similar positions in the Mieses Vienna, white can go g4, and bishop g6 is forced, and now just we take a pawn. We take a pawn because the pawn on b7 is hanging. And if you turned on the engine, it's going to say about +1. After knight e5, it's +1.5. So takes, bishop takes, queen takes d8. Some rook takes, let's say rook f takes, or yeah, okay, let's say rook f takes. We go f4, we go f5, and this is pretty much forced. Rook b2, the bishop, well, may as well gain a tempo on the other rook, and now fe5, and that's it. That's the worst case for black. You give up 2 bishops for a rook. Best case is you lose a pawn if white makes a mistake. So that just doesn't work. So after d5, you cannot take the pawn. Instead, you have to move your bishop. So you have to play something like bishop c5 or bishop e7. And after this, white is just a pawn ahead, and that's about it. So after bishop g4, h3, you play bishop f5. And now the same variation doesn't work. If we go d5, for example, now we can take, because there are no tempi to be gained. You don't lose a piece. After knight e5, bishop e5, it's not about taking the b7 pawn, because h3 is going to hang in the end, and so is c2. So for example, if we play rook b7, then rook b7, bishop b7, and bishop h3. And the bishop is not on this diagonal, it's on this one, so black is perfectly fine. So after the move d4, bishop g4 is what I think black should play. After h6, as I mentioned, knight d2 can be played, but white doesn't have to go for this trick straight away. White can also play something like rook e1. Let's say rook e8, and now knight d2. And now black has to do something. So if, for example, e d4, then white wins. So let's say bishop to d7, safeguarding the knight. And I think this is slightly more active for white. You have the c4 square, you have the e4 square, you may play knight b3, you may even continue with d5 later on, you may continue c4, you may exchange on e5. I think there are just many ideas for white and not that many for black. So in this main line, again, a choice between bishop c5 and bishop d6. I don't think either one is problematic for white, which is why I like the Mieses variation. It's your choice. Now, let's move on to positions where after g3, black doesn't play d5. And we are going to look at positions where black plays knight c6 or bishop c5. They are most often going to transpose, and black is going to play both moves. And they are going to be followed up with d6 and a6. Why? Because a bishop on c5 is unstable. So something like knight a4 could win the bishop pair. We need the retreat square on a7. And d6 simply because we're not going to go d5. So we want to open up this bishop. Now, before we get into the main lines of this, I'm going to show you one independent line where knight c6 is never played until like very late, and it's not as relevant for the setup. And I'll show you what black is trying to achieve. So after bishop c5, bishop to g2, normally black plays knight c6 here. That's what we're going to be focusing on. But what if black just castles? So this is very rapid development, something like the Italian game in reverse, or it is the Italian game in reverse for black. We go knight g2, and now again knight c6 can be played, but c6. Okay, so black doesn't play knight c6. Instead, black plays for c6, d5, and black is actually going to recapture on d5 with the pawn. And this is the only case where taking on d5 with the c pawn is correct. Okay, so white castles, black plays d5. That was the idea. ED, we don't want to allow d4, of course. So ed, cd, and now d4 by white. And e4 is never good. And you're going to be encountering positions like these in several Mieses Vienna positions and variations. If e4 is ever played, you just play f3 and undermine, and the center is just basically gone. So e4 is never good. Against d4, black takes. We take with the knight, and now bishop to g4. Okay, queen d3, you have to save your queen, bishop takes, queen takes, and only now knight c6. And this resembles sort of the Alapin Sicilian. It's an IQP position where d4 can be forced through, so when the queen moves away, d4 is definitely playable. And moving the knight would give black a nice initiative, so h3 should be the best way to play. Saves the bishop, and now bishop c6 should be the best way to play. Now this hasn't been played a lot, but I think it's interesting. It should allow black to equalize sort of comfortably. The engine says 0, 0, 0 after either bc6, bishop takes h3, or rook c8. So that's one independent line, but it's very rare. In most cases, people are going to go bishop c5 and then knight c6. Okay, and they're going to go d6, a6. Now, white strategically should try to win that bishop. If white manages to win the bishop, then that's great. White can go knight g2 here, but doesn't have to. White can also go d3, and they are going to transpose. I prefer playing knight g2 because of quick castling. In this position, black either plays a6 or d6. I think a6 is the main move for a reason. If you go d6, then simply knight a4. And you don't move this bishop away. You don't move the bishop to b6. You invite white to increase your control over the d4 square by taking on c5. And that's what's eventually going to happen. Now, white's usual pawn break here is going to be f4, since we got rid of the bishop. So at some point, white takes on c5 and plays f4. Okay, so for example, bishop e6, bishop g4 can also be played. h5 is one interesting idea, but after h5, white can just go h3 and on h4, g4, closing the position down. This plays against f4, but it's fairly risky. Bishop g4 and bishop e6 are better. If bishop g4, you play h3 and the bishop drops back to e6 anyway. So in this case, d3, you don't have to take the bishop straight away. It's not going anywhere. Let's say queen d7. h3 now guarding the g4 square, and black castles queenside. Okay, so this is sort of the key position here if you are going to go d6 and not and allow white to take your bishop. So takes, and f4. Okay, now who's better here? I don't know. It depends like which side you'd like to play. I'd always prefer to be white here because I have the bishop pair. c4 is the only thing I'm afraid of, blasting through my center. But I don't think it's such a big deal. Firstly, black needs to do something about the bishop. So let's say ef4 and now knight f4. And c4, of course, breaking the center. Bishop e3, connecting the queen and the rook so that you don't lose. cd3. cd3. I prefer having white here. This seems relatively scary. Not that the white king is safe, but it's not unsafe on g1 eventually. The engine, by the way, gives that as slightly better for black, slightly. But that's the problem with the Vienna. It's not a mainline opening. You're not playing for an advantage. You're playing for imbalances. Still, after knight g2, d6, even though it's fine, I think a6 is more straightforward. You just save your bishop and prevent knight a4. This bishop is very strong, and this is white's main pawn break, so why not prevent it? So castles, d6, and this is the key setup for black. Okay, this is in many ways a normal Italian. Okay, h3, preventing bishop g4, knight g4, so bishop e6, knight d5, and in some cases, black is going to take on d5 and white is going to play d4. So you're going to have pawns on d5 and d4, controlling the entire board. Now, in the middle game, that's great. In the end game, white could be worse. So a6 and playing this way for black and eventually taking on d5 is what I think black should do, and then try to transpose into an endgame. So for example, knight d4, bishop takes, c3, the bishop goes to a7, and now d4, ed, cd, and bishop takes, pawn takes. Now, this seems very pleasant to me. If, for example, castles, bishop e3, I think I would like to have black here. There's only one issue. The issue is the c7 pawn. And the c7 pawn is backward. You can never get rid of it. If you play c6, white's weaknesses are gone and the bishops are monsters. So as long as you can keep controlling c7, you shouldn't have any trouble. Of course, if we exchange pieces and get into a rook endgame, c7 is still the main issue, but white has more prominent weaknesses. So I believe this is fine for black. The engine says plus 0.6 for white. Of course, both sides have chances. Let's say something like, let's say queen to d7 and rook to c1. You can see immediate pressure, but there's bishop b6. There's maybe a5 to prevent a4, a5. The pawn is definitely not falling, but long term, it's going to be problematic to defend it. Also, this knight doesn't seem too great because you don't have enough control over e4. And even if it does get to e4, it's not doing that much. But then again, the bishop is kind of stuck defending h3 and it's not doing anything either. So most likely there's going to be a mass exchange down the e file of some sort, and it's going to be an equal endgame. Okay, so that's what happens in positions where black plays bishop c5 and knight c6. Now let's look at two minor lines. The first one is pawn to c6. And as I said, pawn c6 isn't just to play d5 and be able to recapture with the pawn. In fact, in most cases, d5 is going to happen and black is going to recapture with the knight. It's about blunting this bishop. Okay. So white, of course, should play very actively against this. This is a passive move and you need to go d4. Okay. Now, black can take, going into a sort of a la pin Sicilian of some sort. I don't even know what to call that. So if ed4, queen d4, d5, if exchanges happen, like if this is taken, then I think white is okay. But white can also continue bishop g5 and something like bishop e7 and castles queenside. I think this is pretty great for white. I think this is a very, very natural position. Even though the engine thinks black is okay, so something like bishop f6, e5, bishop e7, bishop h3. I'd prefer to have white, but black is definitely fine. Still, after d4, I don't think black should take. Black can continue queen a5, which is sort of a tricky move, but you just go bishop g2, defending your pawn on e4, so getting rid of this pin. But you can do the same thing with bishop b4. I think this is the main move for a reason. You do the same thing, you threaten the e4 pawn, but you don't risk too much by taking your queen out. So bishop g2 and d5. That was the idea. White takes it. Black, of course, takes with the knight, so blunting the bishop. Knight e2, defending d4 and c3, and now e d4 and queen d4. Okay, you don't want to lose on c3. Black castles, bishop d2, for example, although other moves are possible. And now bishop takes, knight takes, queen takes, and it should be roughly equal. I think white's pieces are slightly better than black's pieces, and I actually think this queen is pretty nicely placed. You're going to be able to occupy the d file and castle. I think this is fine. Rook e8 should be the best move, and for example, rook d1, rook d2, defending the knight and castling should be okay. It should be perfectly equal, but c6 has created a target, so you definitely have ideas of playing b4, b5, undermining that and making your bishop stronger. And also, black still has a couple of minor pieces to develop. So against g3, c6, I think, is a nice way to try and equalize, and white should go d4, and if black goes bishop b4, black isn't in any sort of real danger if black is comfortable playing endgames. So if you want to blunt the g3 Vienna, c6 is nice. And finally, let's look at bishop b4. I think this is the most boring way to play for black, but if you want a quick draw, I think it's a great idea. Of course, both sides don't have to follow the lines that I'm going to show you, but I'm going to show you the sensible way to play for both sides. So bishop g2 makes sense, castles makes sense, knight g2 makes sense, you don't want to lose your pawn. c6 makes sense, and now you can see that this resembles the c6 lines. It's actually pretty similar, but white hasn't played d4 immediately. White can go d4 here, and black can defend with d6, or black can go d5. So this blasts through the center, for example, e d5, e d4, queen d4, knight d5, and we get a transposition to what we looked at. Or d4, d6, castles, knight bd7, something like bishop e3, keeping more tension in this position, is also okay. But I would say that white shouldn't play d4 before black plays d5. So get as much done as you can, put your pieces to safe squares, and only then go d4. So I think castles is okay. You wait for black to play d5. Now, black can go d6, but it doesn't make too much sense. Why would you go d6 if you can go d5? So d5. And now we get a pretty similar position again. e d5, c d5, and d4. Again, e4, you can go f3 at some point. For example, e4, bishop g5, bishop e6, f3, this has to be taken, otherwise you lose a pawn, so takes, bishop takes. In a position where both sides have an isolated queen's pawn on d4 and d5, whoever has the attacking bishop is usually stronger. So in this case, white's light squared bishop is placed in a way that attacks d5 and black's bishop is defending, so that's more active. The same thing would happen if, for example, this bishop was on b6 and this one was on e3. So in this case, I believe white would like to exchange dark squared bishops and black would like to exchange light squared bishops, because in any endgame this is going to be a major weakness if white still has this bishop on f3. So again, e4 not a good move. So against d4, black usually takes, and we get the same thing. Knight takes, in this case, works because there is no knight that could take from d5 on c3. And black just takes on c3. So this is the idea behind bishop b4. You want to get this structure where white has doubled c pawns and an isolated a pawn, but you have an isolated pawn on d5. So it's not so obvious that white's endgames are going to be bad. Queen a5 is one of the best moves. Queen d3 defends the pawn, and now knight bd7. You want to chase the queen away when the pawn. After something like bishop f4, I found a move that has never been played. after knight c5, sorry, the knight attacks the queen. People have usually been playing something like queen e3, keeping the pawn, but I believe queen b5 is actually great, and this is an engine line I've been studying because I plan to play the g3 Vienna at some point. So you give up a pawn, but you have this move bishop d6. It's not easy because it's not a straightforward winning the exchange. There's b6, saves the knight, and now knight e2. If you take on f8, then queen takes, so knight e2. Queen c2, and now bishop takes f8. But in this position, not king f8, of course, losing, instead bishop a6, forking queen and knight. And the queen has to move away, queen b1. Okay, if you take on e2, I save my bishop, so you take on b1, rook takes and king takes, or rook f takes, it doesn't really matter, and king takes. White is the exchange ahead, but black is pretty fine. The engine says 0, 0, 0, 0 after knight d4. That's 2 pawns for the exchange, and I think it's very dangerous to play against a passed pawn on d5 and the passed pawn on the b file. So I'm not sure who's better. I think I'd like to have white, but okay. So if they go bishop b4 and they go into this line where everything is exchanged on c3 and they go queen a5, remember this idea of queen b5. I think that's pretty nice. So most people are gonna just aim to play knight c5 and you go queen b5 followed by bishop d6. Of course, if a queen trade happens, then you're fine. I mean, you have the c7 square, you have the d6 square. You're in fact threatening to go bishop d6 straight away, and you'd have to move your rook, but you cannot go to the e file because of knight c7 and so on. So the Mieses Vienna is definitely not the most ambitious way to play, but it's interesting, and I think it should give white great chances if white understands the positions. Okay, tomorrow we're going to be continuing with the Vienna. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.